An old farmer refused to sell his land and paid the price when 3 tattooed thugs attacked him at a small-town harvest fair. When his aging German shepherd leapt in to protect him, the dog was kicked down and left motionless in the dirt. They thought fear would finish the job. They didn't know someone was watching from the edge of the crowd. He wasn't just a passerby. He was a Navy SEAL on leave, and what he did next would expose a powerful family and change an entire town. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, please subscribe for more. Maple Ridge wore autumn like a second skin. By late October, the small town settled into a quieter rhythm, one shaped by falling leaves and shorter days. The air carried a crisp edge, sharp enough to wake the senses, scented with damp soil and crushed apples. Red and gold leaves clung to maple branches lining Main Street, while others drifted down in slow spirals, crunching beneath boots and shoes. The sky that afternoon was pale and high, washed thin by the season, promising cold after sunset. The end of Harvest Fair filled the town square as it had for generations. Wooden stalls stretched in uneven rows, draped with plaid cloth and burlap. Pumpkins sat in neat pyramids, jars of honey glowed amber in the sun, and late apples shone with a dull polish. A fiddler played near the gazebo, his music weaving through the hum of conversation. Children darted between booths, their laughter rising and falling like birdsong. For Maple Ridge, this fair was more than tradition. It was proof of continuity. Near the far edge of the grounds, beside the temporary livestock pens, stood Elliot Bramble. At 68, Elliot had the lean, weathered build of a man, shaped by years of labor rather than comfort. His shoulders sloped slightly forward, but his stance was grounded, balanced. Deep lines cut through his face, especially around his eyes, which were a calm, reflective gray. His hands were broad and scarred, fingers thick with old injuries that never quite healed right. He wore a faded brown canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots stained by decades of dirt and rain. Beside him sat Hawkeye. The border collie was old. Anyone could see that. His muzzle had gone nearly white, his black and gray coat dulled by time. One ear no longer stood upright, folding halfway, and his movements carried the stiffness of age. But his eyes were still alert, amber and intelligent, tracking the ducks with focused attention. Even at rest, Hawkeye positioned himself close to Elliot's leg, a silent habit formed over years. They had done this together for almost a decade. When Elliot stepped forward at the announcer's call, the crowd responded with a ripple of familiar applause. He lifted 2 fingers and gave a short, sharp whistle. Hawkeye rose at once, body shifting from rest to readiness. With subtle hand signals and soft commands, Elliot guided the dog through the routine. Hawkeye circled the ducks in clean arcs, never touching them, never barking, only adjusting, correcting, thinking. It wasn't flashy. It was disciplined. When it ended, Elliot rested a hand on Hawkeye's head, thumb brushing the old scar near the dog's ear. "Well done, partner," he murmured. A few yards away, a man watched with quiet attention. Cade Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, holding a paper cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. At 29, he was tall and athletic, his build compact and efficient. He wore a dark jacket over a plain gray shirt and jeans, nothing that marked him as military. Yet his posture did. He stood balanced, weight evenly distributed, head turning slightly as his eyes tracked movement around him. Cade had returned to Maple Ridge that morning for a single reason. He had stood outside the old firehouse during the annual memorial, listening as names were read aloud. One of them had been his father's. 12 years had passed since the fire that took him, but autumn always brought the memory back sharper than the cold. Cade hadn't planned to stay long. Then he saw the old farmer and the dog. Something about their coordination tugged at him, a familiarity he couldn't name. He took a slow breath and let the moment settle. That was when the atmosphere changed. 3 men moved through the fairgrounds toward the livestock pens, and people shifted instinctively to make room. They did not belong to Maple Ridge. Duke Marrow walked at the front. He was broad-shouldered, thick-necked, his head shaved close. Dark tattoos crept up from his collar and disappeared beneath his jacket. His eyes were sharp and restless, his mouth set in a permanent scowl that carried entitlement rather than anger. Behind him came Gunner Toad, massive and heavy-set, arms wrapped in crude ink. His nose bore the crooked shape of old brakes, and his gaze held a dull, indifferent cruelty. The third, Slim Harris, was wiry and narrow-faced, his movements quick and twitchy. He wore a thin grin that never reached his eyes. Cade noticed them immediately, not for their appearance alone, but for the way conversation thinned around them. Duke's eyes locked onto Elliot. Their first words were quiet, lost in the noise of the fair. Duke leaned close, speaking low. Elliot's shoulders tightened. He shook his head once, firm and final. "No," he said, loud enough to be heard. Duke's expression hardened. Before anyone could react, Gunner and Slim seized Elliot by the arms. A few people gasped. Someone muttered, "Hey!" but no one stepped forward. Duke had a reputation, and fear moved faster than outrage. They dragged Elliot behind the livestock pens, out of clear view. Cade set his coffee down. Behind the pens, the fair's noise dulled, replaced by the restless shifting of animals and the creak of fencing. Duke shoved Elliot against a wooden post. "You had your chance," Duke said. "Just sign it." "That land's not for sale," Elliot replied, breath steady despite the pain. Hawkeye lunged. The movement was fast for an old dog, driven by instinct rather than strength. He snapped at Duke's leg, teeth catching fabric. Duke cursed and reacted without thinking, drawing back his boot and kicking hard. The impact landed in Hawkeye's ribs with a dull, hollow sound. The dog yelped once and collapsed, his body skidding across the dirt. He did not rise. Elliot cried out and dropped to his knees, hands shaking as he reached for Hawkeye. "He's my last one," he whispered. "My last partner." Duke raised his foot again. He never brought it down. Cade appeared from the side, moving without a word. His hand caught Duke's ankle mid-swing and twisted sharply. Duke screamed as his balance vanished. In the same motion, Cade stepped inside Gunner's reach, drove a forearm into his chest, and used the larger man's momentum to slam him into the fence. Slim swung wildly and missed. Cade pivoted, hooked Slim's arm, and dropped him face first into the dirt. Seconds. No wasted movement. Cade released Duke and stepped between Elliot and the 3 men, his breathing calm, controlled. "Don't," he said quietly. People rushed closer now, drawn by the commotion. Someone shouted for security. Duke spat into the dirt, clutching his arm, eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," Duke said. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Cade met his stare. "Leave!" They backed away, melting into the fair, but the promise in Duke's eyes lingered. Cade knelt beside Elliot, pressing 2 fingers lightly to Hawkeye's chest. There was a heartbeat, weak but there. "He's alive," Cade said. Elliot looked up then, really looked, recognition dawning. "Mercer," he said hoarsely. "You're Jack's boy." Cade swallowed. "Yes, sir." The wind swept fallen leaves across the dirt as the fair's music faltered. Somewhere in Maple Ridge, something old and fragile had been disturbed, and it would not settle easily. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of Maple Ridge, a low brick building half hidden by oaks that had already begun to shed their leaves. By the time Elliot's pickup pulled into the gravel lot, the late afternoon light had thinned into something fragile and pale. Wind carried leaves across the hood of the truck, tapping softly against the glass like hesitant fingers. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Dr. Margaret Klein moved with practiced calm, her gray-streaked hair tied back in a loose bun, her posture straight despite years of long hours. She was in her early 60s, slender, with steady hands and eyes that had learned how to deliver difficult truths without cruelty. When she knelt beside Hawkeye on the examination table, her touch was gentle but thorough. The old dog lay still, chest rising shallowly. One paw twitched when Elliot's hand brushed his fur. "His ribs took the worst of it," Dr. Klein said at last. "Bruising, maybe a fracture. At his age, that's serious." Elliot's shoulders sagged. He nodded once, as if bracing himself against the words. "Will he make it?" She met his eyes. "The next 48 hours matter. He needs monitoring, oxygen, pain management. I won't lie to you. This is going to be hard on him." Elliot swallowed, his jaw tightening. "Do whatever you have to." Cade stood a step back, arms folded loosely, eyes scanning the room without seeming to. He listened, absorbing tone as much as content. The vet's honesty carried weight. This wasn't a small injury. This wasn't an accident. When Dr. Klein left to prepare medication, Elliot rested his forehead briefly against Hawkeye's side. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "He's all I've got left." Cade waited until the words settled before speaking. "You weren't wrong to protect him." Elliot gave a humorless breath. "He was protecting me." He straightened slowly, then looked at Cade with a tired clarity. Those men didn't come here by chance. Outside, the sky darkened, autumn pressing closer. They stood beside the truck while clinic staff worked inside. Elliot spoke quietly, as if afraid the town itself might overhear. "Brock Merrow started buying land around the lake 3 years ago," he said. "One parcel at a time, farms, old cabins, anything with a deed. People sold because they were scared or tired." His gaze drifted toward the trees beyond the clinic. "Mine's the last piece he doesn't own." Cade's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why you?" "My wife," Elliot said. The word landed with care. "Before she passed, she made me promise. No condos, no concrete. She wanted the land to stay what it was." His voice roughened. "I kept it for her, and for Hawkeye." Cade let the silence breathe. He pictured a map in his mind. Land, leverage, pressure points. The violence at the fair replayed with new clarity. Not random, not impulsive. A plan. Later that evening, after Hawkeye was stabilized and settled for observation, Cade drove back toward town. Maple Ridge glowed softly in the dusk, porch lights flickering on, smoke curling from chimneys. It looked peaceful. That made the tension underneath feel sharper. He parked outside a weathered 2-story house near the tree line and stepped out into the cold. The porch boards creaked under his boots as the door opened. Rosemary Hale stood there, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a smear of chalk dust on her sweater. She was in her early 40s, tall and angular, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her eyes softened when she saw him, though concern lived just beneath the surface. "You look thinner," she said, pulling him into a brief, firm hug. "You still tell people what to do for a living," Cade replied, the corner of his mouth lifting. Inside, the house buzzed with quiet life. Children's drawings lined the walls. The smell of soup lingered in the air. Rosemary ran the small orphanage attached to the house, a place that took in kids no one else quite knew what to do with. She moved through the space with practiced authority, equal parts warmth and discipline. They sat at the kitchen table, mugs of tea between them. "I got another notice today," Rosemary said, sliding a folded paper across the table. "Zoning violations. They say the land's needed for future development." Cade skimmed it, jaw tightening. "Same people?" She nodded. "Merrow, or someone acting for him." She leaned back, studying him. "You ran into his son, didn't you?" Cade didn't deny it. Rosemarie exhaled slowly. Then it started. Later, alone in his childhood bedroom, Cade lay awake, listening to wind push through the trees. He stared at the ceiling, thoughts aligning into something cold and deliberate. Duke was noise. Brock Marrow was structure. Pressure flowed downward. In the morning, Cade returned to the clinic. Elliot sat in the waiting area, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the closed door. When Dr. Klein emerged, her expression was cautious, but not grim. "He's holding," she said. "That's all we can ask for today." Elliot let out a breath he'd been holding since the night before. They walked out together into the brittle sunlight. Leaves skittered across the pavement. Cade stopped beside the truck, his decision already made. "I'm staying," he said. Elliot looked at him, surprise flickering across his lined face. "You don't owe me anything?" "No," Cade replied. "But this doesn't end if I walk away." Elliot studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Brock Marrow doesn't stop. He just waits." Cade glanced back at the clinic, where Hawkeye lay fighting quietly for breath. Beyond that, he imagined the lake, the land, the promises buried beneath years of soil and leaves. If Duke was a crack in the surface, Brock Marrow was the fault line underneath, and autumn had only just begun to split. Night settled over Maple Ridge with the quiet confidence of late autumn. The air was colder now, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the wind carried the dry whisper of leaves scraping along gravel roads. Beyond the town limits, Elliot Bramble's farmhouse sat alone at the edge of open fields, its windows dark, its porch light casting a weak yellow circle onto the ground. Cade Mercer stood a short distance from the house, half hidden by the shadow of an old maple. He had been there for nearly an hour, motionless, letting the night speak. Every sound mattered. The distant bark of a dog, the low hum of tires on asphalt miles away, the uneven rhythm of wind moving through tall grass. He noticed the tracks first. Fresh boot prints cut through the frost-soft dirt near the fence line, heavier than Elliot's, careless in their spacing. Cade crouched, running 2 fingers just above the impression without touching it. The sole pattern was unfamiliar, too clean to belong to a farmer. His gaze lifted, following the faint disturbance of leaves crushed under weight. Then came the light. A brief flare through the trees. Headlights quickly shuttered. An engine idled low, controlled. Whoever was out there knew enough not to announce themselves. Cade straightened slowly. His breathing shifted, subtle and deliberate. The casual stillness he'd worn all evening hardened into something else entirely. This was no longer watchful patience. This was preparation. 3 figures moved along the edge of the field. The first Cade recognized instantly by the way he carried himself, aggressive, impatient. Duke Marrow walked with his shoulders forward as if already bracing for impact. His jacket was darker than before, his movements sharper, stripped of the bravado he wore in public. Behind him came Gunner Toad, bulkier than ever, his silhouette unmistakable even in low light. The third man was new. He moved differently. Cal Rourke was lean, angular, his posture loose but coiled, like a spring under tension. He wore dark clothing without logos, his hair cropped short, his face narrow and unreadable. He scanned the surroundings constantly, eyes never still, steps light and deliberate. This was not a local thug. This was someone who had been paid to be efficient. Cade marked him as the most dangerous immediately. They approached the farmhouse quietly, Duke whispering something Cade couldn't hear. Gunner chuckled under his breath. Rourke said nothing. When Duke reached the porch, he kicked the bottom step hard, splintering old wood. "Come on out, old man," Duke called, his voice low but sharp. "We're done being patient." Inside the house, a lamp flicked on briefly, then went dark again. Cade moved. He slipped along the fence line, boots silent on the cold ground. When Gunner lagged behind, Cade closed the distance in seconds. A sharp strike to the side of the neck dropped the big man without a sound, his body folding into the grass. Duke spun at the noise, cursing. Rourke reacted faster, drawing a knife from his sleeve. Cade didn't give him room. He used the porch post as cover, forcing Rourke to angle wide. A kicked loose board skidded under Rourke's boot. That half-second was enough. Cade drove forward, smashing Rourke's wrist against the railing. The knife clattered away, a knee to the ribs, a twist, and Rourke went down hard, gasping. Duke froze, eyes darting between the fallen men. "Damn it!" he shouted. "I told you we should have just burned the place." Elliot's door burst open as Duke charged it. Cade tackled him from the side, slamming Duke into the dirt. Duke thrashed wildly, swinging fists without aim. "You don't get it," Duke snarled, spit flying. "The old man doesn't sell. My dad told me to wipe it clean." Cade's grip tightened. "Say that again," he said evenly. Duke laughed, breathless and unhinged. "He said Dep Chosak. His words. My dad doesn't like loose ends." Cade dragged Duke closer, angling his head toward the small recorder clipped discreetly to his jacket. Duke kept ranting, rage overriding caution, every word spilling faster than the last. When sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Someone in town finally calling it in. Cade released Duke with a sharp shove. He backed away, hands raised just enough to look non-threatening. The attackers fled into the trees, dragging Gunner between them. Inside the house, Elliot sat on the floor, shaking. His face was pale, eyes wide, breath shallow. I thought this was it," he whispered. Cade knelt beside him. "It's over for tonight." They didn't stay. Minutes later, Cade's truck cut through the darkness toward the orphanage on the edge of town. The building glowed faintly, warm and solid against the cold. Rosemary Hale met them at the door, her expression tight with concern, but her posture steady. She took one look at Elliot's shaking hands and said nothing, guiding him inside. In the quiet hallway, a small sound drifted from a side room, a faint, uneven breath. Cade stepped closer. Hawkeye lay on a blanket, eyes half open, chest rising shallowly. When Elliot knelt beside him, the dog's tail twitched weakly. "He's alive," Elliot breathed, tears slipping free. "He's still here." Rosemary stood back, arms folded, watching the reunion with a careful softness. She handed Cade an envelope without a word. Inside was a typed notice. No letterhead, no signature. "Inspection scheduled before winter. Full compliance required." Cade's jaw tightened. "This isn't random," Rosemary said quietly. "Someone wants us scared." Later, in the dim kitchen, Cade stepped outside and made the call. Dana Holloway answered on the second ring. She was in her late 30s, voice sharp and controlled, the kind that wasted no syllables. Cade described the night in clipped detail, finishing with Duke's recorded words. There was a brief pause. "That's enough to start pulling threads," Dana said. "Stay put. Don't escalate." Cade looked back through the window at Elliot and Hawkeye, the old man's hand resting protectively on the dog's fur. "They already did," he replied. The wind howled through Maple Ridge, rattling branches and doors alike. Somewhere beneath the town's quiet surface, something ugly was moving. And now it had a name. Late autumn tightened its grip on Maple Ridge. The last red leaves clung stubbornly to bare branches, rattling softly whenever the wind passed through town. Morning fog hung low over the lake, blurring the line between water and sky, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Dana Holloway arrived without announcement. She stepped out of a dust-coated government sedan just after dawn, wearing a dark wool coat that did nothing to soften her presence. Dana was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with ash-brown hair pulled into a severe knot at the base of her neck. Her face bore the calm sharpness of someone who had spent years dissecting lies for a living. Steady gray eyes, minimal expression, movements precise and economical. When she shook Cade Mercer's hand behind the closed doors of the orphanage kitchen, her grip was firm, professional. "You were right to call," she said quietly. "This isn't local anymore." By noon, a small, silent network was in motion. 2 unmarked vehicles rotated through town. Phones were scrubbed, locations compartmentalized. To Maple Ridge, it looked like nothing more than another quiet fall day. To Dana, it was a board being set for endgame. The break came from an unexpected direction. Marla Ridgewood had spent 10 years at Brock Merrow's side, close enough to smell the rot, but never daring to acknowledge it. She was 32, slim with carefully styled chestnut hair and nervous hands that betrayed her long-practiced composure. Officially, she was Brock's executive assistant. In reality, she was the lockbox. Calendars, shell companies, consulting fees, and silent payouts flowing through her desk. She met Dana at a roadside cafe outside town, hands wrapped so tightly around a mug of untouched coffee that her knuckles were white. "I can't do this anymore," Marla whispered. Her eyes darted to the window, then back. "He's not just pushing people, he's erasing them." Dana listened without interruption. Marla swallowed hard and continued. Brock had already decided Duke was a liability. Too loud, too reckless. Within a week, a contracted enforcement crew was scheduled to arrive, men with no connection to Maple Ridge and no hesitation about violence. Elliot Bramble's land was the final obstacle. Once it fell, the lake project would be sealed. "They'll make it look like an accident," Marla said, voice shaking. "A fire, a fall, something clean." She slid a flash drive across the table. Dana didn't smile. She simply nodded. "You did the right thing." By evening, the trap was designed. Word was leaked through the same channels Duke trusted. Elliot was back at the old farmhouse, stubborn as ever, refusing protection. Alone. Vulnerable. The farmhouse stood as it always had. Weathered boards, sagging porch, memories baked into every creak of wood. To Duke Merrow, it looked like unfinished business. He came after dark with 2 men, neither local. Their faces were hard, unreadable, movements professional. Duke's confidence returned as he stepped onto the porch, crowbar slung casually over his shoulder. Inside, Elliot sat in a chair by the door, Hawkeye at his feet. The old dog trembled, still weak, but when the porch boards groaned under approaching boots, Hawkeye pushed himself upright, planting his body squarely between Elliot and the door. His growl was thin, fragile, and defiant. Cade stood just out of sight, pulse steady. The door burst inward. Before Duke could speak, floodlights ignited across the yard. Commands cut through the night, clear, sharp, unmistakable. "Federal agents, down on the ground!" One of Duke's men reached for his waistband and never finished the motion. He was tackled hard, pinned face down in the dirt. The second froze, then dropped flat. Duke stumbled backward, crowbar slipping from his hand. Cade moved then, positioning himself between Elliot and the chaos. Hawkeye leaned into Elliot's legs, teeth bared, refusing to retreat despite the tremor running through him. "Easy, boy," Elliot whispered, one hand buried in his fur. Dana stepped forward as Duke was cuffed, her expression cool, unyielding. "It's over," she said, "for you and for your father." Duke's bravado cracked. "You don't have anything," he spat. "He'll bury this like everything else." Dana didn't argue. She simply nodded toward one of the agents. The next morning, Brock Merrow was arrested in his glass-walled office overlooking the lake he'd tried to own. FBI jackets filled the hallway. Financial crimes, coercion, threats, environmental destruction. The evidence, Marla's files, Duke's statements, recorded orders, stacked higher than Brock's money ever had. Maple Ridge woke up stunned. At the orphanage, Rosemary read the official notice twice before lowering it, tears blurring the words. The investigation had traced the zoning threats directly to Merrow's enforcers. The accusations were void. The land was safe. For the first time in weeks, the building felt warm again. By sunset, the town gathered near the lake, drawn by rumor and relief. People spoke in low voices, connecting dots they had ignored for years. Why certain projects failed, why certain families vanished, why fear had settled so quietly into daily life. Cade stood apart, hands in his jacket pockets, watching Hawkeye rest beside Elliot on a blanket. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of voices, alive and stubborn as ever. Dana joined him. "You could have walked away," she said. "Most people would have." Cade didn't answer right away. He watched the lake catch the last light of day, red leaves drifting across its surface. "Sometimes," he said finally, "the mission isn't big. It's just close." Dana nodded once. As darkness fell, Maple Ridge exhaled. For the first time in years, the town belonged to itself again. Autumn did not end in Maple Ridge with a sudden cold. It softened instead, as if the land itself wanted time to remember what it had survived. The maple forest by the lake burned quietly in shades of red and copper, leaves drifting down onto soil that, for the first time in years, no longer felt threatened. The announcement came on a clear morning. State officials stood at the edge of the lake, microphones crackling in the crisp air, and read the declaration aloud. The shoreline and surrounding fields were now formally recognized as the Maple Ridge Late Autumn Preserve. Protected land, no development, no exceptions. Elliot Bramble stood a few steps back from the podium, hat held in both hands. At 68, he looked older than he had a month before. Lines deeper, shoulders slightly stooped. But there was a steadiness in him now that hadn't been there before. When the words "permanently conserved" were spoken, his breath left him in a long, quiet exhale. Hawkeye sat at his side. The dog's coat had regained its shine, the stiffness in his movements gone. Though his muzzle was gray and his body carried the wear of years, his eyes were clear and alert, following the flutter of leaves like a young dog again. Children from the town lingered nearby, whispering his name as if he were something legendary. To Elliot, Hawkeye was more than that. He was memory. He was grief survived. He was the last constant after his wife's voice had faded from the house by the lake. Now Hawkeye rose slowly and barked once, short, sharp, alive. The sound echoed across the water. The trial of Brock Merrow unfolded quietly in the nearby city, far from the trees and fields he'd tried to claim. There were no dramatic speeches, no public spectacle, just documents. Testimony, numbers tracing back years of coercion, laundering, and environmental sabotage. Maple Ridge followed the news through brief updates on radios and phones. Each guilty plea felt less like victory and more like release. The town no longer flinched when unfamiliar cars drove by. Doors stayed unlocked a little longer. Conversations lingered. Peace returned the way it always does, slowly, and then all at once. At the orphanage, Rosemary Hale watched children run across the expanded yard, their laughter carried by the wind. She stood with her sleeves rolled up, hair loose from its usual tie, clipboard tucked under one arm. The new funding had arrived 2 weeks earlier. A classroom extension was already underway, the scent of fresh-cut lumber mixing with fallen leaves. Rosemary moved through the space with quiet authority, her calm presence anchoring the chaos of growth. Nearby, Elliot knelt beside a group of kids, demonstrating a simple hand signal. Hawkeye responded immediately, sitting, staying, waiting. "Rescue dogs aren't about force," Elliot said gently, voice rough but warm. "They're about trust, same as people." The children listened closely. Across the field, Cade Mercer stood apart, hands resting loosely at his sides. The familiar tension had returned to his posture. Not danger this time, but departure. He wore civilian clothes, but the discipline in his stance never faded. His eyes tracked the perimeter out of habit, even now. Dana Holloway had left days earlier, her work finished. Marla Ridgewood departed under federal protection shortly after, carrying nothing but a single bag and a future she would have to rebuild from the ground up. Word came later that she'd been accepted into a nonprofit focused on land conservation. A small beginning, but an honest one. Cade watched Elliot finish the lesson. When the old man looked up and caught his gaze, he nodded once, already knowing. They met near the fence line as the sun dipped lower. "You're heading out," Elliot said. It wasn't a question. "Orders came through," Cade replied. "I ship out tomorrow." Elliot reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, a worn leather collar lay in his palm, the brass bell dulled with age. "Hawkeye wore this for years," Elliot said. "Back when the nights were quiet in all the wrong ways. I'd ring it just to hear him move, just to know I wasn't alone." He pressed it into Cade's hand. Cade hesitated, then closed his fingers around it. The metal was cool, solid. "I don't know how to thank you," Elliot added softly. Cade shook his head. "You already did. You stayed." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need filling. That evening the town gathered, not in a hall, not with banners or speeches, but along the dirt road leading out of Maple Ridge. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, children. No ceremony, just presence. Hawkeye walked beside Elliot at the front, tail swaying slowly. Cade stepped onto the road, pack slung over one shoulder. He paused, taking in the faces turned toward him. Gratitude wasn't loud here. It lived in steady eyes and small nods. Rosemary raised a hand in farewell. Elliot tipped his hat. Hawkeye barked, soft but insistent. Cade smiled once, then turned toward the forest path, red leaves crunching beneath his boots. The bell chimed faintly in his pocket with each step, a sound that followed him into the trees. Behind him, Maple Ridge settled into itself. Ahead, the forest opened, glowing with autumn light. In everyday life, courage doesn't always wear a uniform or make headlines. Sometimes it looks like an old man refusing to sell his land, a loyal dog standing guard despite pain, or a stranger choosing to step in when walking away would be easier. This story reminds us that protecting what is right, people, places, values, often begins with one quiet decision to care. If this story touched your heart, think about the small ways you can be a protector in your own life. A kind word, a firm stand, a moment of courage when it matters most. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story about loyalty, courage, and the light that grows when good people choose to act.